Now, there is a very interesting concept called as Spring Actuator. For example, if you open your IntelliJ IDEA and you have, let's say, a service running up and running, and let's say if you go to this, let's say, Run tab, you can see inside the console, my service is up and running. If you go to this actuator, so there is something called as this actuator. What is this actuator? This is a there is a dependency called as Spring Boot Starter Actuator. You can see currently in my project, I have not added this Spring Boot Starter Actuator dependency, so it is automatically showing. Do you want to add it? To enable it, I'll say yes, please add it. So it is going to add Spring Boot Actuator. Now, what exactly Spring Boot Actuator is and how exactly it helps us? Let's start talking about that. So you can say that the Spring Actuator is a module, or you can say it's a package that is going to help us provide us some production ready monitoring features that are very useful for a Spring Boot application. For example, you can see I've added the Spring Boot actuator. If I rerun my application, if I go to the console, you can see it's going to rerun it. You can see the application is up and running. Now, if you go to actuator, now you can see there are three things: Beans, app, health, mapping. Okay. Now, if you go to Beans, what this Spring actuator package helps us to do is it can help us to track all the corresponding beans that has been created for our application. Now, you know what is beans in the world of Spring? Beans are what? Just your objects, right? And who is responsible for creating these beans? Your Spring containers are responsible for creating these beans. So what all beans have been actually constructed, you can actually check that here. For example, if you want to check that, let's say there is a service class that you prepared, whether the bean for that service class has been prepared or not, you can come to this Spring Boot Actuator beans tab, go to your service, and then you can actually take a look at it. For example, if let's say if I go to services, there is a service called as, if I go here, there is a service called as Redis location service. So if you scroll down and you can see this Redis location service is actually marked with the @service annotation. So if you just go here, you can see Redis location service IMPL. So you can see this object, or I would say this bean has been created by Spring Boot. So you can verify that whether the bean has been created by Spring Boot or not. And it actually shows you kind of like a dependency chain as well. If you carefully see here, you can see there is a location controller. This location controller is dependent on this Redis location service object, or you can say Redis location service bean. And this Redis location service bean is dependent on Spring Redis template. If you carefully go here, can you see it is dependent on Spring Redis template, and you can see there is a dependency injection done for that as well. So it will actually show you kind of like a dependency graph, that if you go to the location controller, you can see location controller is dependent on location service. Now location service is implemented here. This location service is dependent on Spring Redis template, and you can check that for anything. For example, if let's say you go to the controller, location controller, you can see a similar kind of a dependency you'll see here. And there are a lot of internal beans as well, because there are a lot of packages that we have installed. What these packages internally depend on, you can even check that as well. For example, if you come up here, you can see there is something called as Redis config, and there is Redis connection factory. If you remember, like if you want to set up Redis, you have to go through this Redis connection factory. So how exactly Redis connection factory is prepared? What are the dependencies of Redis connection factory? What other things are dependent on Redis connection factory? All of these things you can find inside this particular chart. Okay, this is good for debugging purpose in case you have a very complex set of dependency chaining going on here and there. Then this particular, I would say, chart or chain actually helps us to figure out a lot of things. And apart from that, if you go to health, then what exactly Spring Actuator does is, if you go to this mappings, for example, it provides us a couple of URLs. On these URLs, you can actually do a health check of your application. For example, if you go to this URL, if I go to my console, my server is up. You can see port 7777. Okay, what I can do is I can open a browser console, or I would say let me just open a browser. I'll go to localhost 7777 slash actuator slash health. Okay, if I press enter, can you see this API I have not prepared? This is automatically given by Spring Actuator, which says status up. That means this service is up and running. So you can see it actually provides us a couple of, I would say, different handlings. For example, if you just go for slash actuator, it will show you some more URLs that you can go for slash health, you can go for slash health slash path. All of these things you can actually check, right? So it kind of like shows us set of health checking URL. So you can use this Spring Boot Actuator APIs to actually check if your service is up and running, you can do a health check of your service. For a lot of time, for example, if let's say there is another service which is dependent on this particular service to be up and running, you can do that check. You don't have to manually implement an API altogether, right? So this is what your Spring actuator actually helps you to do. But one of the biggest part is that like you are able to see what all beans have been created and in which order they have been created, because internally like exactly how these beans are created is using your Spring containers, right? Now apart from these beans, there is something called as a Spring application context as well. the so there is an interface. Spring application context is actually technically an interface, okay. What Spring application context overall helps you to do is, you can say that it represents the Spring IOC container. I talked about a couple of IOC containers already in the previous set of lectures. I would highly recommend you guys to watch that. But you can say that Spring application context is responsible for initializing, configuring, and assembling together all of the beans using these IOC containers, right? So all of these beans that you are able to see here, you can say that creation of these beans, configuration of these beans, let's say if there is a default configuration, and then assembling these beans, that okay, first this bean should be created, then this bean should be created. All of this is actually done by Spring application context classes, okay. So you can actually say that there are a couple of implementation that Spring automatically provides for this Spring application context, right? But overall, the main use case of Spring application context is just to make sure that it is able to create your beans properly, right? It's kind of like a central interface to the Spring framework for the configuration, right? All the bean factories, all the resource loaders, event handling, everything that is being done is behind the scenes for creating these beans is done by the Spring application context. So it's kind of like an internal set of interfaces and classes that actually does that. But if we want to see that eventually using Spring application context, what all beans have been created, these are all the corresponding beans that have been created. And you can just take a look at any specific one of these. If you want to like see some details around any specific one, you can see that all of these things you can actually do, right? It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward altogether, right? And you can just go to any particular bean, you can see the chart here, you can see where exactly what configuration it has been there, which particular package this is coming from. All of these things you can see using the Spring actuator. So it's a pretty cool and handy, I would say, tool for development purpose. I would highly recommend you guys to check this one out.